in between the outbreaks, the lockdowns and the vaccine blame game, you may have missed that the Australian government is going hell for leather trying to keep the Great Barrier Reef off a list of World Heritage Sites in danger. The lobbying effort has seen the reef host international ambassadors, while the Environment Minister has been deployed to Europe for a week of face-to-face meetings. Now, whether they succeed or not, it won't change the fact that there is a very real threat to the reef from warming ocean temperatures caused by the burning of fossil fuels. And while governments of all stripes in Australia have failed to offer up targets to lower emissions, it seems that the actions of other nations might soon force their hand. Overnight, the EU unveiled a range of proposals that would make the bloc carbon neutral by 2050. The plan is ambitious: an effective ban on the sale of petrol and diesel cars, a tax on aviation fuel, and generous tax incentives for low-carbon transport alternatives.
Europe is now the very first continent that presents a comprehensive architecture to meet our climate ambitions. We have the goal, but now we present the roadmap to how we are going to get there. Our package aims to combine the reduction of emissions with measures to preserve nature and to put jobs and social balance at the heart of this transformation.
To tell us more, Richie Merzian, who is the Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, joins us from Canberra. G'day, Richie.
Hi.
Imagine this. Imagine standing up and saying, OK, we're going to ask a lot of our citizens, they said, and then they said, look, after 2035, you pretty much won't be able to buy a fossil fuelled car in the EU. I mean, that is just, before we get to anything else, that is just enormous.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's impressive. It's bold. I mean, these are the kind of decisions we have to make. This is what net zero means. Even the Prime Minister admits there's no point in having a target if you don't have the bold action that goes with it. Here's the bold action. And the best part is electric vehicles, they're cheaper to maintain, they're cheaper to fuel, and in the EU, they certainly have a number of cheap models. So it makes sense to go down this path, especially when transport's about 20% of their emissions.
Yeah. OK, and so looking at transport, they've also said, OK, we're going to have to look at aviation fuel and put a tax on that. So all those, the Europeans have become, accustomed to fares in, two figures, less than $100 to get, I don't know, from Dublin to Paris or something. Presumably that won't continue if you start to tax aviation fuel in the way that they're imagining that they're going to try and do.
Yeah, it will increase the price, but that's really just reflecting the real price of aviation. So instead of ticking a box like I'm going to offset my flight, it's now included in the price, and that means that people can make a more informed decision about whether they should fly or, in Europe, take other forms of transport which are available. And so it is encouraging that real shift in thinking that has to go with these actual political changes.
And I mean, just before we, get to the trade implications of this for Australia, the scale of that ambition, and they've got to get it through. They've all got to agree, and then they've got to legislate it, and they've got to figure out how to do it. But no more petrol and diesel cars within 20 years. So that's the end of the combustion engine in Europe. And they said, well, we'll just solve the problem. Every 60 kilometres on a highway, we'll put an electric charging point, so you're not anxious about that. Yeah. And we'll give you financial assistance to, insulate your house and make other long-term changes. This is a huge ambition for them.
Yeah, but, I mean, unless you actually have a bold vision of where you want to end up, you won't have car companies making the necessary decisions that they need to make to, move to all these models. They'll get, I mean, how much is an electric car in Australia? And the reason is we don't have the infrastructure, we don't have enough imports, and we don't really have a market because you can't drive it far enough yet. And it's just, it's chicken and egg. And I think this is a really interesting move.
Well, one of the most controversial ideas is the so-called carbon border tax. It imposes a tariff on energy-intensive goods imported into the EU from countries that don't have carbon prices in line with those imposed by European producers. So that'll essentially mean Australian producers of things like steel and aluminium will face huge taxes on their European exports if Australia doesn't implement a price on carbon in line with the EU.
Emission of CO2 must have a price on CO2 that incentivises consumer, producers and innovators to choose the clean technologies, to go towards the clean and sustainable products. And we know that carbon pricing works.
And it's not just the EU doing this. In the US, Democrats have agreed to include a tax on imports from nations that lack aggressive climate change policies as part of their new budget plans.
The United States and the EU have to think in terms of the leadership that we can provide and the message that we have to send to China and other countries that would take advantage of the high standards that we're going to enact.
All of this, understandably, has raised the hackles of the Australian government.
Our major concerns are that we think it's protectionist, we think it will undermine international cooperation rather than promote international cooperation. We think it would be much better to incentivise countries to deal with emissions reduction rather than penalising them. We think it's a suboptimal way of reducing emissions, and we worry that it's focused more about raising revenue than really reducing emissions themselves.
So, Richie, let's just look at this from the perspective of the Europeans and the Americans. Why would, I mean, they can do whatever they want in their own country, but why a carbon border tax on our steel, our aluminium and all the rest of it? Why would they want to do that?
They're doing it because that's how you get to net zero by 2050. That's how you at least half your emissions in the next decade.
But they can go ahead and do it. We don't mind. Why tax us?
Because right now in the EU, they're basically given a free pass to their most heavily polluting industries, given they have to compete with imports that don't face a carbon price. So now that they have to actually turn their entire economy around, they can't give these free passes out. So the way that they justify it is saying, well, don't worry, local industry, we'll make sure imports face the same carbon price. So really it's to stop dirty industries at home moving to places overseas and setting up shop there where there are no carbon pollution controls. This is really the recipe for ensuring a fair way to actually get to those net zero targets, and it's something that we think will actually catch on beyond the EU.
Okay, so domestically, in terms of your politics, you can't turn to your steel producers, your aluminium producers and say, we're going to put all these extra costs on you to produce green steel and green aluminium, but, you know, the Aussies and the Chinese and all the rest, you can just import it from them. That wouldn't work domestically, but it also wouldn't work in terms of the planet either, because you just let the dirtier producers, the more carbon-intensive production, you just let them do it. And so you'd be back where you started, having killed your own industries. Is that it?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this is the recipe for you to hit your targets and ensure that you do so in an equitable way, and also avoid protectionism. Protectionism comes when you actually, tax imports and allow your local industry to not pay any further tax. That's a protectionist carbon tariff. This is not a carbon tariff in that way. So in fact, the World Trade Organization's former executive director has said the World Trade rules are not a barrier to doing this. In fact, they're a compass for how you could do this, because this is about making a more equal level playing field. So for the Australian government, instead of claiming it's protectionist, they should be engaging in this constructively, because whilst there's only a small portion of our goods that are actually traded to the EU, if the US adopts this, if Japan adopts this, or South Korea, it's suddenly a far bigger problem.
Terence, you've written a little bit on this because you've seen this coming. You've seen this coming from Europe and from America and from elsewhere. And the conclusion that you came to is it's not so much our exports of all these goods, steel and aluminium. It's the fact that the Chinese use our coal to produce most of the world's steel and aluminium. And if they get clobbered by these carbon border taxes, they might have to find a greener way to make them, and they might stop buying so much of our coal.
Yeah, that's right, Ellen. So I think the implications with EU and the proposal that's come out overnight, essentially there's a phase-in mechanism with EU. There's a bit of time that's been given where all you have to do is report the emissions, and then from 2026 they're talking about introducing a tariff. So phasing in, and similar to your question about airlines, gives industry a chance to adjust and innovate. And we found that with concrete, with the London Olympics. London Olympics tried to contract green concrete, and it's much more expensive. But by the time they gave a 5-year sort of warning, and by the time it got around to it, the price was down to normal concrete. So industry can innovate, and the phasing in approach that EU's come up with overnight, I think allows us to do this. But I think the bigger implication for Australia is the supply chain impacts. If more countries have carbon border adjustments, and B, if the supply chain implications are built in to the products that are getting taxed, and then it'll be a much bigger impact.
So in other words, Ewan, you sit there in Europe in a couple of years' time and you say, where's the steel from? China. How did you produce it? We used a smelter. What did you use to make the smelter burn? Australian coal. Aha. Righto, you're going to have to pay a tax on that. I'm sorry about that. And so Victoria University's done some research that essentially says if the Chinese went, ouch, we better change that. That could cost 3,000 coal jobs, and you and I both know that the sort of coal we're talking about, coking coal, there's a lot of it in central Queensland. 3,000 jobs.
So, certainly so. Alan, I'm going to have a couple of dollars each way here. I was in a meeting with the TT, the Transport and Tourism Federation. Alan Joyce raised the issue before 2013. That Europe was going to move towards taxing aviation fuel, especially from other countries and all that sort of thing. That this is something that's been coming. The big thing about Europe, though, is they've got massive nuclear power plants, so powering all their stuff.
Well, we're not talking about it. Be really clear, though, Ewan. We're not talking about Australian coal-fired power stations which burn thermal coal. What we're talking about is the hope of the side with the coal lobby, which is metallurgical coal, coking coal, dragged out of the ground in Queensland, which is currently pretty much the only way we've ever had since 1880 to turn bauxite into aluminium. Now, if there's a carbon club that's going to gang up against us, Victoria University is saying that's 3,000 Queensland coal jobs just like that. And that's just Europe. That's just Europe.
Okay, but there's no other way to make steel at the moment. There's no other way to make aluminium. So someone's going to need the coal anyway, whether we have a price on it or not. No matter where is it going to be paid. But places like Darwin City Council have said that by 2030 they will be 100% electric vehicles, from the people that go around and collect the coins out of the parking meters to their garbage trucks and their earth movers. So there's places in Australia that are already moving towards this sort of thing as well. When it comes to European farmers and that sort of thing, the problem Dan has, I think, at the moment is, and having previously worked in the trade portfolio, he's that there's so much subsidies in Europe and there's so many other ways of getting the end result that what Dan's talking about is maybe a more level playing field. They're giving us access. I mean, he's right when he says that that very few of our things can actually get to Europe, and that's because the cost of production is subsidised so heavily towards the farmer that it doesn't matter what they produce, and they throw tomatoes out. And so, what I think Europe's very good at pointing the finger at everyone else. What they've got to be able to do is bring the rest of the world with them. And if the USA is going to move that way, well, great.
Let me go to Jenny.
Industry is completely and utterly at the centre of this, and I think he's 100% correct with the green cement story. If industry sees it happening this way, it will move.
Yeah, then you come back to the chicken and egg argument that Anne put earlier. We're running out of time. Let me just go to Jenny May on this. I know this is a passion of yours.
I guess my comment is I don't know the realities of the carrots and the sticks as people are talking, but pragmatically, aren't we hearing very sincere and significant signalling from global entities that we must be looking for carbon neutrality? And isn't that the message that we need to keep having this discussion? I'd love another roadmap or plan or something that keeps heading us in the direction for those on the ground, those coal miners, to have an idea of what other jobs are going to be out there. you know, what is our country going to look like? And I'm certainly very happy to be looking towards a low emissions economy, and I'm very happy to be embracing, you know, low emissions transport, but I'm going to need some help to get there.
And I'm going to quote Terence to you. He wrote in a blog piece, there's a perfect storm brewing out there that will end up driving Australian climate policy. Do you think he's right?
Yeah, well, interestingly, I think hitting people in the financial nuts probably works pretty well. But the downside of it will be is if you put tariffs in, it's walls, and that means probably the end of any global cooperation. It'll be much more fought through trade forums, and I find it an intriguing idea. I mean, one good thing is that we might see a much more speedy move to, say, green coal in green steel in Australia. You might see all those projects that are on the drawing board move forward really fast.
Very quickly, Terence, we're nearly out of time. Dan Tehan said that everyone should use the Australian approach, which is technology, not taxes. You quoted the Sustainable Development Report. Where did Australia rank of all the nations in the UN, 193 nations that were ranked for climate action?
Last.
Yeah.
So just going back to the issue
really quickly,
of climate change.
Yeah.
Very quickly, 2020 was the warmest year. We have experienced carbon dioxide concentration levels that we haven't seen in 800,000 years. And we are looking at getting a cut of 0.5%, according to current pledges by countries, by 2030, when we need 45% reduction by 2030.
Yeah.
So Europe has to go forward.
Yes, and Europe, America are the greatest emitters of all, and so they are going first, and we are watching them do it. A wonderful program tonight. Thanks so much for joining you. Good night.